Okay, juniors, today we're going to get into and start our chapter 24, talking about the civil rights movements of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and a little bit getting into present day. So we're going to start by discussing our civil rights movement here and starting um, kind of in the 1950s, about 10 years after World War II, and discussing the civil rights movement and what it looked like for African Americans. So oftentimes when we think about this era of history, I think that we commonly think of the struggle that African Americans had in obtaining civil rights. To define civil rights, again, civil rights are um, looking to extend certain rights to groups of people that otherwise they may not have. So, in the case of African Americans in the 1950s, 60s, um, what was happening is they were oftentimes um, being disenfranchised in the sense that they were not being allowed to vote, they were being harassed, segregation, and items like that other groups of people in the United States got to enjoy. So when we start talking about civil rights, we're looking at the extension of rights to certain groups of people. So we start this discussion on civil rights by starting with African Americans and focusing specifically on segregation right away. So again, the kind of the attitude, especially in the southern United States around this time, you're talking the old Confederate states, and what had happened is during Reconstruction, as we had learned, is Southern states had tried to pass laws to limit some of the new rights African Americans received following the Civil War. So, for example, the 15th Amendment that gets ratified that allows African Americans to vote, that was something that came about, 1870, right? Southern states going into the turn of the century, they were doing whatever they could to limit that right. And in addition to that, oftentimes Southern states would try to segregate, to divide African Americans and whites using segregation laws, using de jure segregation by law. And in a Supreme Court case, our actual Supreme Court, in the case Plessy versus Ferguson, upheld that segregation was constitutional on the grounds of separate but equal. And that was in 1896. That was before the turn of the century. That was our U.S. Supreme Court that said that segregation was legal based on the principle of separate but equal. So what you see happen following that decision in 1896, you see the Southern states pass more extensive what they call Jim Crow laws, and those were the laws that aimed to segregate African Americans and whites. And oftentimes these Jim Crow laws, you saw them, in the southern United States, the former Confederate states. So that's kind of where we pick up here. And then talking about World War II, and again, during World War II, African Americans are going to serve in the war. They go to Germany and they go to Asia, and they're fighting these fascist regimes. And so when they come home and the war is over, African Americans are thinking, well, we should have more rights now too, because, look at our service during World War II. And ultimately, that's kind of what leads to this spark in the civil rights movement, this bigger movement in the 1950s and 60s for African Americans. So one group that was particularly important in trying to fight for these civil rights for African Americans was the NAACP, and we've talked about that group before. It's the National Advancement for Colored People, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, focusing on extending civil rights to African Americans and fighting segregation in this case. And they had a number of important individuals and such, but one of the most important people was Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was a lawyer who served for the NAACP. And the one issue, again, that we said they wanted to focus on was fighting segregation. So many southern states had passed laws that segregated African American and white students in school, where you'd have, black only schools and white only schools. And so there's a case in Kansas in 1954 involving little Linda Brown, who wanted to go to the school that was just her, her family wanted her to attend the school that was just down the street. However, it was a white only school. Eventually what happens is this gets fought in the Supreme Court by the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall. And as a result of this Brown versus Board of Education ruling, the Supreme Court's going to rule opposite as to how they did with Plessy versus Ferguson, where in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court established the principle of separate but equal. In the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court's actually going to say otherwise. They're going to say the opposite, in the sense that segregation, racial segregation, was not constitutional. And this is in 1954. They issue another ruling on the case about a year later, saying that schools need to start integrating or ending segregation like right now. And so what you see as a result of that is you see a lot of resistance in some of the southern states to do so. States like Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, those places, those states, their governors are going to fight this, saying, well, this cannot be forced on us because of our state's rights and things of that nature. And so that leads to a variety of incidents and riots and, things that were not so good. But in one of the most famous events, we have the Little Rock Nine. There was 9 African-American students that wanted to attend Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And that, again, schools had to integrate. The governor of Arkansas at the time, his name was Orval Faubus. And he was, under the impression of he did not support the integration of schools, as we would call it. And so very, famously, he actually called in the National Guard, the Arkansas National Guard, to prevent these 9 African-American students from attending school at Central High. And Dwight Eisenhower, this is 1957, Dwight Eisenhower actually steps in as president and says, hey, not so fast. National Guard of Arkansas, you are now under my control. And then Eisenhower actually sent in even more paratroopers, federal troops, to protect the kids as they went from class to class within the school. And again, the students eventually did get into school. They weren't treated the best. There was a lot of issues there. And, the next year, actually, Central High School is going to get closed. But again, kind of one of those early important civil rights movements gains, I guess you could say, for African Americans. But again, kind of like some of the negativity associated with that and the behavior on the parts of the people who did not want the African Americans to attend is a very disgusting thing. In 1957, the United States is going to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And basically what that does, or what it did, is it allowed the U.S. Attorney General to have greater power over school desegregation. So it took some of the power away from the state governments, and it also helped extend more voting rights for African Americans, as there were still many states that tried to suppress the voting rights of African Americans. There's also another kind of incident early on in the 1950s here, looking at the city of Montgomery, Alabama. Okay, this is 1955, where we see the infamous Montgomery bus boycott. So public transportation was also segregated. Oftentimes African Americans were forced to sit in the back of the bus, where seats up front were reserved for the white passengers. And again, that was one of these segregation laws. And so NAACP decides that they're going to fight this here a little bit too. And young Rosa Parks is going to sit in front of a bus on the public transportation system in Montgomery, Alabama. She's going to be asked to move, doesn't move, later gets arrested and that kind of thing. And eventually what happens, it leads to the popularity of a young pastor by the name of Martin Luther King Jr., who is going to kind of, I guess, be the spokesperson for this African-American civil rights movement kind of going forward. One of them, probably the person that we oftentimes think of most when it comes to promoting civil rights for African Americans. And again, his big message was using nonviolent protests to bring attention to some of these issues. And the group that eventually he's going to help co-found is known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Okay, continuing along here and looking at some other items, and we talk about another incident again involving the segregation of buses. So again, that was a major form of transportation here at this point in time in the 1950s and 1960s. And so there's going to be a group in 1961 known as the Freedom Riders, and they're going to take a long bus trip across several different states to test the interstate travel and the segregation rules pertaining to, as you travel on a bus from one state to the next. Again, segregation, can't be a thing essentially. And so these Freedom Riders were harassed, they were beaten on the buses. It's absolutely disgusting. And there was a lot of media attention that came from this bus trip. And eventually a young President Kennedy is going to say, what are we doing? There's media attention or media coverage showing how poorly these people were being treated, the Freedom Riders. And eventually what Kennedy does is he actually ordered the Justice Department to send U.S. Marshals to Mississippi to protect these Freedom Riders as they traveled on the bus. Okay, so again, the JFK and really the Kennedy family, his brother Robert will do some early work with civil rights as well. They were kind of like some of the first presidents to, actually bring attention to this. We also talk about the integration of universities. James Meredith in 1962 is going to win a Supreme Court case that that allows him to attend Ole Miss in University of Mississippi, right? And again, kind of a controversial thing at the time. There was going to be, a lot of protests about him attending and such. And eventually, what happens is President Kennedy again orders federal marshals there to protect James Meredith while he's attending school. It leads to some riots and some issues on campus. And again, one of those things where people thought very, very strongly about not integrating schools. Martin Luther King Jr. In early 1963 is going to lead, kind of again around the same time here of the integration of universities in Birmingham. He is going to lead one of these peace marches. And again, it became less peaceful, and they were trying to bring attention to laws again that, Jim Crow laws that oppress the rights of African Americans. And during this peace march in 1963, there's going to be a lot of, again, some of the most infamous images of the civil rights movement, where officers are going to, spray the marchers with hoses. They're going to sick attack dogs on them, or police dogs. And again, not a good thing. And Martin Luther King Jr. is later arrested for the laws that were broken as a result of this march. And so while he's in jail, he's going to write the famous letter from Birmingham jail, where basically Martin Luther King Jr. kind of responds to some of the local church clergy that questioned what he was doing and breaking the laws. And basically, in this letter from Birmingham jail, one of the big things that Martin Luther King Jr. says is, hey, if a law is not just, we have the right to break it because it's not a just law. And so it's a really interesting read. Again, he gained more and more popularity here. And again, this is still 1963. In that summer of 1963, there's going to be the famous March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. will give his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, one of the most powerful, oratory speeches given in world history. But again, one of those things where he ultimately talks about his goals for, the civil rights movement and relations between different races. So that's 1963. Kind of in between that and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in November of 1963, John F. Kennedy is assassinated. Again, John F. Kennedy was he was a president that had basically demanded that Congress do something for civil rights, that they pass the Civil Rights Act. So shortly after Lyndon Johnson takes control, again, we think of Lyndon Johnson a lot when it comes to the Vietnam War. But again, kind of in the same time period, Lyndon Johnson will eventually sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this was a big one because it prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, religion, national origin, gender, and all these different things. It also allowed citizens more rights for using public property. Okay. So that was a big piece of legislation. John F. Kennedy had kind of got that started, doesn't live to see it get passed. Also in 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is going to be passed. Again, African Americans had the right to vote, since the ratification of the 15th Amendment in the late 1800s. But so many southern states would do things, especially to try to prevent African Americans from voting. And one of those things was literacy testing, where you had to prove that you were able to read in order to vote. And so a lot of African Americans, given the fact of history and that there was certain African Americans that had never received an education and therefore could not read, these literacy tests would disenfranchise them or not allow them to vote. So this Voting Rights Act of 1965, it bans literacy tests. It makes it a federal law, saying that states cannot deny somebody the right to vote based on their ability to read. Shortly thereafter, in 1964, we add the 24th Amendment to the Constitution. It gets ratified, where, again, that goes back to the states, right? 38 states have to approve of a constitutional amendment to add it. It's a big deal when we add an amendment. And that 24th Amendment banned poll taxes, basically saying that a person cannot be charged a fee to vote. There was a lot of southern states, especially that would charge poll taxes to African Americans to try to prevent them from voting. Okay, other challenges and some changes here as we get further into the 1960s. And in the late 60s, we'll see the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. But early 1960s, you see, especially in some of the Midwestern cities like a Detroit and a Chicago, you're going to see a variety of riots and, race riots, I guess, where, you know, African Americans would oftentimes, either be rioting or there'd be riots over, um, different other racial elements. But that was something that became a thing in the early 1960s. And then you're also going to see the rise of another civil rights leader, maybe a guy that we sometimes think of being maybe a little bit more controversial than Martin Luther King Jr. just because of his message. But that is Malcolm X. And Malcolm X, again, wanted the same things as Martin Luther King Jr., more and more rights for African Americans, but where they did not see eye to eye was on how to go about getting that. Malcolm X was more about, maybe using force, even if that meant using weapons to obtain rights. And so maybe a little bit more of what a person would call an extreme view on how to obtain, civil rights for African Americans. Whereas, Martin Luther King would also talk about whites and blacks living peacefully together. Malcolm X, would say that that just wouldn't be possible. He kind of changes his attitude on that a little bit. But eventually his big slogan becomes known as ballots or bullets, that African Americans will obtain their civil rights, hopefully through voting in the democratic process. But if that would not be possible, then maybe bullets would be, the option to turn to. Like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X will also later be assassinated. We also talk about the rise of the Black Power movement. That was kind of the another kind of a black nationalist thing that gets started by a young man by the name of Stokely Carmichael. And basically it was maybe a little bit more aggressive. People like Martin Luther King Jr. would say that it kind of had a negative connotation on just, the sound of it. But that was something else that there's a rise in popularity of in the early 1960s. We also see a rise in the popularity of a group known as the Black Panthers, started by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Again, maybe a little bit more of an extremist kind of group, where a lot of times members of the Black Panthers would walk around, and they'd be armed, they would have weapons on them. And, they oftentimes protested like police brutality and things of that nature. And in addition to that, their big thing, because of some of the poverty faced by African Americans, the Black Panther Party, they would provide a lot of aid to the poorer areas, to the ghettos, where they would provide doctor services and food and daycare and things like that, trying to help some of these underprivileged individuals, African Americans that lived in these ghettos. Eventually, kind of in the late 1980s, they kind of fall apart. But for a period of time, especially in the 1960s, they were very popular. We talked about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. And then really the last thing here that we'll talk about in regards to this early movement of the 1950s and 1960s is the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which ended the discrimination in housing, where now African Americans could seek, different places to live without being turned down because of the fact that they were not white. Okay, so just some things here. Early civil rights movement. We will talk some more current issues at a later time.